story I have for you today is called The Wolf Girl. And it starts back in the early 1800s in this area, before there was a Columbus and before there was even an Indiana. This territory was rightfully claimed by the Delaware tribe of Native Americans. But settlers were starting to encroach, and one of the early settlers in this area was named David Stipp. He and his wife came here and started a farm along the banks of the Haw Creek River north of what would eventually become Columbus. But back in that time it was Native American land, and he was living there without rights to that land. And it was a nice farm, and the soil was rich and game was plentiful, and the farm grew. And the Native Americans never made war against David Stipp and never attempted to drive him from this land, because the Native Americans knew that that land was cursed and had been cursed for all eternity. Anyone who lived there would be miserable, die an early death, and their children would bring nothing but misery to the land. But the Stipps knew nothing of this and just knew that their farm was flourishing. And in time, Mrs. Stipp grew pregnant, and the family was about to grow. And it was a difficult pregnancy, and Mrs. Stipp was bedridden for the last month of the pregnancy. And that was unusual in these days when work was needed from sunup to sundown, especially in the wilderness of Indiana. And eventually her time came and she went into labor with the child. And because David Stipp was a farmer, he knew that his wife's labor was unusual, and the agony she was going through was not normal. He'd birthed many farm animals over the years, and he knew that his wife needed help. And so he saddled his horse and rode quickly to the nearest town, which was some distance away. And there he found the doctor, or whoever passed for the doctor in that community, and asked him, begged him, to come to his farm and help his wife, because she would surely die in the childbirth without assistance. And the doctor was hesitant because he knew that land belonged to the Native Americans and he had no business being there. The longer that David Stipp begged and cried, the doctor's heart was finally moved, and he grabbed several of his friends to help come along as security and protection for the long journey. And during the trip back to the farm, a thunderstorm broke loose. The sky tore open, and rain and wind and thunder and lightning. And a bolt of lightning hit a nearby tree and spooked David Stipp's horse. The horse reared back, and Stipp fell from the horse, hit his head on a rock, and died immediately. And the doctor and his companions were concerned, but there was nothing they could do, and they knew that if they didn't hurry to the farm, the wife would be lost as well. And so they did. But of course, without Stipp's guidance, it took them a while to find the farm. And when they finally arrived, they saw that Mrs. Stipp was outside the farm, laying in the weeds alongside the house. And the doctor didn't even have to get off of his horse to know that she was dead. She had died in childbirth, which wasn't uncommon in that day, but what was uncommon were the bite marks and the blood. And the baby was nowhere to be found. The baby was gone. So the doctor and his companions did the only thing they could. They dug a hole in the thunderstorm and buried Mrs. Stipp there on the farm and went home. And the farm lay vacant for years after that. No one would go near the property. And eventually the farm crumbled and the forest retook the land. And in the years after that terrible incident, the communities along the edge of the Native American land reported wolves. There'd always been wolves, of course, but more wolves. The wolves became more persistent. Their howls were a nightly thing and became very commonplace. And the farmers along the edge of the forest saw that more and more of their livestock was being taken by wolves. And if any unfortunate animal escaped its enclosure, it was never heard from again. And so the communities banded together and formed a group of the most skilled hunters to go thin the ranks of these wolves and make the community safer for the people. And the hunters went out to find the wolves, and they did. And among them, they saw a human girl, what they thought was a human girl. And they thought it their duty to separate this poor child from these beasts and bring her back to civilization. And because they were skilled hunters, they were able to separate this wolf girl from her pack. And they saw that she was more or less a human, but covered in a dark hair, almost a fur. She had deep calluses on her hands and feet from running on all fours with the wolves. Her shoulders were broad and more muscular than any human they'd ever seen, much less a child. Her teeth were long and yellowed like a wolf's fangs. She was truly one of them. And through much effort and biting and yowling and howling, they did manage to tie her up and secure her. They brought her to a nearby farmhouse and to hold her until something could be done. One of the hunters ran back to town to gather a minister who might be able to pray for this poor girl's soul. And in the meantime, the other hunters locked her into a bedroom of the farmhouse. They boarded up the window. They tied her to the bed, and they drew an iron bar across the door. And all was well until dark. But after dark, the wolves began to howl. She began to howl. Her howls were an unearthly scream, something the hunters had never heard before, and it chilled them. And the other wolves heard this cry for help, and they gathered around the farmhouse. A huge pack, several dozen large, shaggy wolves surrounded the farmhouse. First, they dispensed with the farm animals, the chickens and goats and sheep. And after that, they started clawing and biting at the windows and doors of the farmhouse. The hunters came out with their guns, determined to put an end to this menace. And while they did eventually shoo the wolves away, drive them back into the night, more than one hunter was killed, dragged to the ground, and mauled by the wolves. But when the survivors finally came back into the farmhouse, they realized that during the fight, the wolf girl had pulled the boards loose from the window and escaped with her pack into the night. After that day, there were no more hunting parties that went out to try to find her, although hunters and trappers and eventually settlers did catch sight of her several times over the years. And even into the early 1900s, when the last wolves of this area were exterminated, the settlers would tell tales of wolves in the area who had an uncanny intelligence and almost a human-like understanding of people's ways. And even now that the wolves are gone, sometimes in the night you can hear their cries if you listen. You'll hear them howling in the night, the ghosts of the wolf girl and her pack, aiming for revenge against the eternal curse that was placed upon them.